Moens, happy to be here with you this evening. I am so happy. I've been wanting to do this show for a while. And again, I'm Charles Morris. Welcome to the Journey 2020. And normally at this time you would see Dr. Robinson, but as you know, he's been on hiatus now for about 3 or 4 months. Moved into a new building, got a lot of new projects. He's blessing a lot of new people. God blessing him, and so we're very thankful for that. As you know, from time to time, we have some very special guests on the show. Well, today I'm here to tell you that I was very happy when I sent out the email and it came back and he responded. And I'd seen him in a while, but it's one of those things where this person had been on my mind ever since I heard him speak quite a few times, and we're going to get into that. Introducing Skip Moen, right? And welcome to the Journey 2020. But tell us who you are, in the sense that you have an interesting background. And I invited Skip to come on the show because he can break down the Hebrew Bible, people. And I am fascinated by that. And to hear some of the words, because you kind of have to be kind of like a brainiac, in my opinion, because in some of the pronunciations, and then you're able to break it down. But you got to help me out and tell us a little bit about Skip before he got to that point. Where you from, and how did you come to on that calling?
Well, I was born in Seattle, Washington. Grew up in the Northwest. My family lived on one of the foothills of the Cascades, and many years ago,
Okay.
I'm old. Many years ago, we lived.
You
at
look
the
good,
end,
though. You look good.
We lived at the end of a dirt road. We walked out to the bus stop every day to go to school. The roads were gravel. There was nothing paved. Today, it's like a huge bedroom community. I'm sure anybody who's lived in Orlando all their lives would say the same kinds of things.
Right.
Once it was all orange groves, and now it's nothing but houses. Well, the same thing happened when I grew up. We lived on 10 acres. The closest neighbor was a half a mile away.
Wow.
All that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And had the typical public school, junior high, high school. Ultimately ended up in a college in Seattle, and that sort of introduced me to my thought process about what was happening with my relationship with God and what was happening in the church.
Okay. Now, I don't want to, but did you come up in a religious home? I mean,
Yeah, I would say, we were members of a Baptist church.
Okay.
We went to church on Sunday. Religion was a part of your life.
Okay.
My mother was probably the most religious person in the home. I have 3 younger brothers. We sort of church was the obligatory kind of thing that you did when you were growing up in that kind of environment.
Okay.
But when I went off to college, something really amazing happened in my family. I was gone off to college, and my parents moved from a Baptist church to an Assemblies of God church, and that really shook up the family, because we had been in the Baptist, very conservative Baptist church for a long, long time. And I came back from my first year at college, and all of a sudden they're going to an Assemblies church, and their experience with God radically changed. It became much more real to them than simply what we do on Sunday. In my undergraduate work, I met a few really critical people in my life. One of them was a professor at the school where I was going, Seattle Pacific, and he had been a missionary in Africa. His name was Talmadge Wilson, and he sort of introduced me to the idea that there is a lot more in this text than simply our translated copies. And in fact, that's when I first took my very first Hebrew class was from him. The school didn't teach Hebrew, but I sort of got together with him, and we were like, okay, well, we need to start thinking about this. And I realized that some of the things that we read in the Bible in translation actually aren't there in the original text, or they've been modified in order to make them smooth in translation, because the language of the original documents, Hebrew and Greek, doesn't read the same way as English, and so a translator has to take he has to do some altering of the text once in a while to get it to read properly in English. This is especially true in Hebrew because it doesn't work like English at all.
Okay.
So then I went off to college, and in my senior year, I read a book by a man named Francis Schaeffer. The book was called Escape from Reason. Francis Schaeffer had a kind of Christian commune in Switzerland. People came from all over the world to discuss things, to get a chance to investigate more with more depth. There were no topics that were off limits. You could really dig into things. And the book that he wrote really introduced me to this whole idea of what happened in the history that shaped the way that our culture thinks today.
Okay.
He talked about art and philosophy and politics and economics and the things that really shape how we think.
Okay.
And he showed that the biblical orientation toward our culture is really very different than the way that the culture actually spins out. And he was kind of a radical guy in those days.
What does that mean when you say spin out?
The results of the kinds of things that we get today in this culture really come from 2,500 years of Greek, Western, Roman thinking. They don't come from the biblical worldview at all. I mean, we like to think that they do, but if you really examine what happens in the culture, you'll see that it's influenced by politics and social ideas and economics far more than it is by the biblical text.
Right. Okay.
So I often say to people who come to hear me lecture now, you can think of our world today as sort of a cake, right? And the cake is made up of the Greco-Roman world. But the icing on top of the cake for many centuries has been the Judeo-Christian ethics. So that we had a kind of value system that was the icing on the cake. And now, over all these centuries, that icing has been eaten away or licked off the cake or whatever, and now we're living with the cake. And the cake is very different than what the Bible has been teaching us for hundreds of years that we thought was going to hold the culture together. So anyway, I was introduced to this idea by this guy, Francis Schaeffer, in his book, and I wrote to him and I said, I have to talk to you. I know you're in Switzerland. I'm in Seattle, Washington. I need to come and see you. And I got a letter back from him that said, yeah, come.
Wow.
So I did.
Okay.
Off I went to Switzerland, and I spent a year
Basically
living in Lausanne or living at his, with the 2 or 3 different chalets that he had in a little tiny village in the Alps called Weymouth-sur-Olonne. The place was called Le Brie. I spent about a year there. I met people like Oz Guinness, who came through from India, hitchhiking from India. I met opera stars and guys who were double PhDs from Moscow. And I mean, there were people from all over the world there. And it was a fabulous place to really exercise your mind. And it set me on this course that I've been on ever since.
Wow. Now, see, now I'm fascinated with that, because what did you think set him apart? What motivated him? What drove his spirit, do you think?
Well, his story is really kind of a funny story. He went to Switzerland as a Presbyterian minister to actually go to one of the... Switzerland is divided, like the United States is divided into states. Switzerland is divided into cantons. And each canton is separately regulated by the administrators of that canton. And they have a religious orientation. So some cantons are Catholic and some are Protestant, right? And he was a missionary to one of the Catholic cantons. And he got into all kinds of trouble and they kicked him out. So he moved to the canton across the lake. It's like Geneva. So he's living on the other side of Lake Geneva in the canton that would accept him, and thinking, what am I supposed to do, God? I came here and I just got kicked out, right? And his daughters were off at school in England, and they came home for a holiday and brought some friends with them. And they sat around and started talking about all this stuff at the dinner table, and pretty soon some more people came, and then they went home, and then they brought some more people back, and it just grew from there. And he all of a sudden found that people were coming from all over the world by word of mouth. They heard about the place, and all of this community developed out of that.
Wow.
And God used him for years in that capacity. I think the thing that made him so different is that he was not afraid to investigate. He wasn't the kind of man who would say, you have to believe this, and we can't question it.
Okay.
He was all about, let's understand how this came about, let's dig into it, and let's understand what it really means.
Okay.
And I loved it because he was talking about the arts, and he was talking about theater, and he was talking about movies, and he was talking about all these things that form the culture, right? And showing the long history. I mean, we talk about paintings from the 1500s and how they reshaped our view of the world, and that kind of stuff, right? How we went from Byzantine art to the Renaissance art, and what that meant in terms of shaping the culture. So it was a fascinating place. And everybody who was there worked half of a day and studied half of a day, and then the meals were hours long because we would talk and talk and talk about all this stuff at the dinner table, right?
Right.
So, it was a great introduction to this.
No, that's now I'm sitting here and I'm trying to guess and put myself in that place and the conversation and the people and what that is like, and I can't. Is it not fulfilled, but can you tell that it's a spiritual gathering? Is it one of those things where you just feel good because of what's in the room? Are you sharing stories about this and that? But is it more spiritually led?
It's sort of, in hindsight, you look back and you realize that God called all these people there.
Right.
But you don't see it happening. This is very typical of the way God works. You
Right.
don't see it happening while you're there.
Right.
You just realize that, oh my goodness, there were 2 kids there who were drug addicts off the street of London. There were 5 people who hitchhiked from Indonesia. There, as I said, there was an opera star, a Playboy bunny, a guy who was a doctor from Pakistan. I mean, they came from everywhere. And the best part about that is when they came there, everybody felt safe. They felt like they could question, they could raise any kinds of issues that they were struggling with. And the group itself and the people who were resident there, Francis Schaeffer, his wife, his 2 daughters and their husbands, who sort of contributed to the community, you felt like you could really ask the questions that you were always bothered with, that nobody else would treat. And I studied 4 or 5 hours a day in the philosophy of Martin Heidegger and all these people that really challenged you to think about how we think. And other people would be reading in books about how the transition of art happened, and people were talking about architecture, and they were talking about medical ethics, and they were talking about social issues, and all kinds of stuff was going on all the time. So the conversations were broad and fascinating. I remember we had a long discussion at dinner one night on 2001: A Space Odyssey. We talked about the movie, because it was such a cultural thing that helped people realize what was happening in their world. It was the kind of place where you went away thinking, at least I have some insight into what's happening in my culture, before you just feel like you're being pushed along by it, And that sort of opened the door for me to start asking, why do we think this? And why do these things happen to us? And what are the really big forces in the culture that are shaping how we think that we're unaware of? And I've sort of been following that path ever since, although there were some pretty good side roads along the way.
Right. Now, when at that time, because of your curiosity or your spirit was driving you to do what you do, when did it started to sink in to where you started to say, well, I'm starting to understand, if at all?
Yeah, good question. I just graduated from college, so I just finished my bachelor's. Went off to L'Abri for a year and realized at the end that I was in the wrong field. Right? So I went back to the United States, finished a second bachelor's degree in philosophy.
Okay.
Then went to seminary in Chicago, 2 years in Chicago, did a master's in philosophy of religion at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and then went back to the University of Washington, did another master's in philosophy there. Then did some work, some social work in juvenile prisons and all this kind of stuff, and then ultimately went to Oxford to do my PhD. And all of that stuff was connected to Francis Schaeffer pushing me to think, why do these things happen? What is it that makes us think the way that we do? So by the time I got to Oxford and was working on my PhD, I'd been thinking about this stuff for a long time.
But now, let me see if I can ask this right.
Okay.
Okay. When you were at different levels going to school,
Mm-hmm.
how did the philosophy change, or if it changed at all, in your perception of what you were studying and your outlook on life, and what you thought was what you were being taught is,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
what really is? I mean,
Yeah, what happened is along the way,
Uh-huh.
as I realized more and more about the influences that shape the way that we think, I became more aware of the radical differences between the way that the Christian worldview thinks about the world and the way that the ancient biblical worldview thinks about the world, and they're different. They're very different.
Wow, that's
By the time I got to
That's deep.
Oxford to work on my PhD, I
Okay.
worked on one little topic that's about that difference. In other words, how the ancient worldview of the Hebrews sees its relationship with God and its relationship with the world differently than the culture that we came out of, the West, that grew out of this Greek idea. Greek ideas are really the foundation of the Western world, and they're not the same as the Semitic ideas that come out of the ancient Middle East. And once you start realizing that those are different, then you're faced with, okay, wait a minute, the Bible is an ancient Middle Eastern document
okay.
written in that language with that perception of the world, very different than the West, which is where the church came from. What are those differences, and how do they show up in the way that we think? And that's really what I've been working on for the last 40 years.
Okay. Now you're going to have to help me.
Okay.
And when you're talking about the differences,
Yeah, they're huge.
the huge.
Huge differences. I'll give you just one example, the thing
Okay.
that I wrote my doctoral dissertation on. Okay?
All right.
The Greek, it's about time. Okay? In Greek thinking, time is, we conceive of time as linear. Like you had a line, right?
Mm-hmm.
We do this all the time. We call it the timeline.
Mm-hmm.
And we make points on the line of different events that happened.
Mm-hmm.
And we think that all these points on the line that we know about were in the past, and we're at the point of the line in the present, and there are things in the future that are on the line that we still haven't seen yet.
Okay.
The Greeks talk about that as if it's a flow of a river, and you're standing on the riverbank. Where you stand is the present. The future is flowing toward you because it's already there in the river,
Right.
and everything that's already gone by you is the past.
Okay.
Okay? That linear idea of time
Okay.
is all over the place in the Western world. It's how we do our calendars. It's how we think about what we're planning. You know, you sit down and have a 5-year plan, right? Or the church has a,
Right.
you know, a 1-year plan or whatever. All that stuff is linear thinking. We're thinking about what we're going to do in the future based on what we know about the past, right?
Right.
The Hebrew idea of time isn't linear.
Okay.
It's a non-linear time. That is, it thinks of time as, you know, you remember a slinky when you were a little
Right.
kid? Okay.
Okay.
It was round,
Mhm.
but it also coiled so that it kept moving around a circle, but it never repeated itself.
Okay.
Right? So you would go around the slinky, and then you'd be at the next level down, and then you go to the next level. It's like a spiral staircase.
Okay.
Right? So the spiral staircase goes around so that it repeats, but every time that it goes around, it's one level deeper. Okay?
Okay.
So the idea is it's not linear time. It's time where things happen again, but they happen in ways that they're not, they repeat the pattern, but the characters and events change every time you go down one set of stairs. Right?
Okay.
So if you're thinking in Hebraic time, you're thinking First temple is like Second temple. Adam and Eve is like the story of Abraham and Sarah. The story of David and Bathsheba was already repeated 3 times before it in the text. Ruth is a repetition of another story, right? When Jesus comes, he repeats things that have already happened, except each time that they're repeated, they're also just a little bit different. It's, I'll give you another way to think about it. If you painted a white dot on the outside of a bicycle tire, and then you rode the tire down the street, every time the white dot met the cement, the pavement, it would be a repeating circle, but each time it touched the pavement, it would be in a different place. Okay? So that's the Hebrew idea of time, which means that things in the past are repeating, but they're repeating differently each time they go around. Right? The things in the past aren't once and forever now gone on the linear straight line of the past. Things are actually happening again, but every time they happen, they're a little bit different. Okay? So, let me give you an example of how this applies. So one of the things I talk about when I lecture to people is about what happens in civilization when we repeat patterns. And I can basically show you that the pattern that we're going through in the United States today, in the Western world today, is the same pattern that was repeated by the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Canaanites, right? The Romans, the Greeks, the Holy Roman Empire. It's just the same pattern again and again and again. You think that we've solved any problems with this last election? No, we're just doing the same thing that the Romans did, and their civilization collapsed for exactly the same reasons. So you see the pattern happening again. The problem is we think linear, and therefore we think, oh, the past, it's over with. There's nothing to learn from the past. Wrong. The biblical view is there's everything to learn from the past, because if you keep doing the same things, the same results are going to happen.
It's kind of like there's nothing new under the sun.
What do you know? A biblical concept, right? Where does that biblical concept come from? Because the same things are happening again. You're going around the circle, right? But in Greek thinking, whatever is in the past is over with, right? It's finished, it's done, it's in the past. But that's not true in the biblical sense, because the past can always come back and repeat itself again. If you don't learn from the past, you are destined to repeat it again. So now let me explain what happens in a culture where we don't think that way. We stop teaching history. We send our kids to school, and they don't learn the history of the United States, the history of Europe, the history of the ancient world, because it doesn't matter. Because what matters is what's going to happen tomorrow, not what happened 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. And so our children don't have a sense of this, of the imminent threat of making the same mistakes that happened in the Roman Empire. They don't see the world in terms of repeating patterns. They see the world, the Disney world, that somehow the future will be better.
But it's kind of obvious, isn't it, that history repeats itself over and over again?
It should be obvious. So then why is it that in the public school today there's not a huge emphasis on learning the events in history so that you will stop making the same mistakes?
I really would want to ask you that question.
And it's because the culture itself, the Greek culture, even though we would say, it's obvious these things are happening again. Can you tell me, here I'll ask you how obvious it is. Can you tell me what happened in the Egyptian 14th dynasty in the 3rd millennium BC, that's 3,000 years BC? Can you tell me what happened in their economic systems that's the same thing that we're doing today?
Really?
Yeah, same thing. And by the way, it led to their collapse. Right? Can you tell me what happened in the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD what social events, what value systems in the Roman Empire did they challenge and make mistakes with that led to the collapse of the Roman Empire?
But one of the things, like when you're saying what you're saying, and I've always understood this, that history repeats itself, and that we are who we are, and that we're not any different.
And I think you're right, but the problem is we stop teaching our children that if they understand how the Romans handled abortion, they might realize what a threat it is to the civilization today. because the Romans had the same problem. They had the same issues. And their solutions led to the collapse of the ethics of the society, which ultimately imploded the society. And we don't teach the people what happened in Rome. We think it's a Roe versus Wade problem. Wrong. It's a problem that happened 2,000 years ago, and the politicians had solutions then, and they didn't work.
Wow.
Right?
Right.
Same thing with taxes. Same thing with education. Same thing with political systems. It's the same stuff over and over, but nobody pays any attention. Our politicians don't pay any attention to what happened in history because they think that they're going to come up with a new solution.
Right.
But then you're right. Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. Right?
No, this is funny because I have a lot of questions.
Anyway, that's just one little piece of this thread. There's a lot more.
Right. But see, that's... I mean, there's so much that I would...
Sure.
But anyway, let me ask you this right here. I'm gonna go off. One of the sessions that you taught at Westbrook, and help me to understand it, and that was when you was talking about the Jewish religion, that it used to be one. And then you said something about they didn't want to repeat themselves, and that it became separate.
I don't recall exactly that, but let me make some comments about the idea. Okay?
I mean, when you was at Westbrook, you were saying something about originally the Jewish religion, and it was, I guess it was, and I don't know if you were talking about when it came to the Jewish religion and Christianity or something.
Oh, I might have been talking about that. Okay,
yeah.
All right, so what I was pointing out is, and this is a history lesson, right?
Okay.
The history lesson is that in the first century, our Greek New Testament, those are documents about events that occurred in the first century, right? They didn't happen yesterday. The Bible wasn't written for you. It was written for people in the first century, right? So if I'm going to understand what the meaning of the text is, I have to understand what it meant to the people who heard it in the first century. And in the first century, the world of relationship to the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, the world that related to him was very different than the world that we experience today. Israel was the center and the focus of the God of Israel. And those people who believed that Jesus was the Messiah came into the Jewish way of life. There wasn't any Jewish, the word religion doesn't get invented until about the 3rd century, right? That word doesn't even exist, okay? It isn't about religion, it's about a way of life. It's how I live, right? So it isn't, we think of religion today as, confession of faith, doctrines, creeds, all this stuff, but those didn't exist, right? What existed was how I live. In other words, how I eat, how I talk, how I dress, what kinds of prayers I say, it's the way I live, right? Okay, so there's the Jewish way of life, and the people who recognize that Jesus is the Messiah, they are Jews, right? They're maybe a couple of Gentiles, but the whole New Testament is about Jews who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and Gentiles who are now coming to understand that, and they're coming into this way of living, this Jewish way of living, right? And that actually historically goes on for several hundred years, so that the Gentiles become part of this Jewish way of living. About 100 in 135 A.D., there's a revolt. It's called the Bar Kokhba Revolt. It's a Jewish revolt against Rome, where a group of Jews actually kicked the Roman administration out of Israel. And Rome comes back 30 years later with a vengeance and just slaughters people right and left and exterminates all of the rebellion, okay? That process that happens in those 30 years sets the Gentiles that were part of this Jewish way of life in a different direction than the Jewish people. And the reason is obvious, right?
Well, during that time, how was the Gentiles looked at
They were looked at as Jews.
Okay.
Yeah, because they came into a Jewish way of life.
Okay.
So they became Jewish in their practices.
Okay.
You know, you could still be born in Ethiopia,
Right.
but you practiced the Torah observance, you practiced the kosher eating laws, you went to the temple services, you followed all the Jewish way of life. So effectively, you looked like you were practicing a Jewish way of life, even though your background was Ethiopian. Okay? So what happens, though, is this.
Okay.
When the Romans come in and they decide to exterminate all these people who have rebelled against them, what do they ask? They ask, are you practicing the Jewish way of life? They basically say, are you a believer in the book? That would be the Hebrew Scriptures. If you're a Gentile, you can say, I wasn't born Jewish, right? And they won't kill you. If you're Jewish, you say, this is my book.
Right.
Off with the head. So guess what? The Gentiles and Jews begin to separate because those people were worried about dying. The Romans are killing everybody who's a Jew, right? So that pushes them into two different directions. One other thing happens, a very important thing on the Jewish side of the equation. There's a rabbi, his name is Akiva, he's one of the most important rabbis in Jewish history. And in order to stir people to fight the Romans, he named the head of the Bar Kokhba revolt, he named him the Messiah. So this is the most important rabbi, and he says that man is the Messiah. Now, let's suppose that you are part of an assembly where you believe that Jesus is the Messiah.
Okay.
And Rabbi Akiva comes and he says, no, the Messiah is Bar Kokhba. And you say, no, the Messiah is Jesus. I can't follow this guy.
Right.
He's not the Messiah. Right?
Right.
It's perfectly okay as long as you're winning. But when you lose, the people who have now claimed that they're following Akiva's Messiah, they come back and they say to you, hey, you didn't help us. You see, you should have helped us and we would have won, but you followed this other guy and as a result we lost. It's your fault. So the Jews went one way on the basis of that, and the Gentiles went another way. And that started this break. Before that, they were all living together. They were all practicing together. They're all worshiping together. They're all following the same way of life together. But what happens as a result of the Bar Kokhba revolt, by 165 AD, they start to separate. And when they start to separate, the Gentile population of the people who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Gentile population takes over and begins to reshape how they think about the world, what they think about the text, the way that they're going to practice their faith, and they start down the path that ultimately becomes the Christian church.
Now, take me
200 years later, you have the Christian church and you have Judaism, but before that, you don't. Yeah.
Wow.
That's right. The Christian church is invented between 250 and 300 AD.
How is that when it comes to...
Now, I know the text in Acts, people in the Christian church believe that the text in Acts says that the Christian church begins with Pentecost.
No. My question
Okay.
that I want to ask when it comes to Peter and Paul.
Yes.
Okay. Based on your understanding
Yes.
in the writings,
Yes.
how did that came out? I mean, how did that came to be?
You mean why did they have disagreement?
Well, I meant in reference to the understanding of Peter and Paul in their writings out of the Hebrew.
Yeah, so Paul is a Jewish rabbi, right? He tells us that. He's a tribe of Benjamin, a Pharisee of the Pharisees, always kept the Torah, followed all the obligations of the elders. Remember when he stands in front of Felix, he gives that whole argument, right? You can also remember that he claims in front of Felix that he's being persecuted because of the resurrection. Remember what happens? The Pharisees all say, we don't find any fault in this man. The Sadducees go crazy. There's this big argument in court, right? And obviously Paul is claiming that his Jewish heritage never changed. He didn't change his way of practice, right? Then you remember the incident where Peter is fellowshipping with Gentiles who come into the assembly. And then when the Jewish authorities show up from Jerusalem, remember Peter stops eating with these people. It's called table fellowship. It's really important in a Jewish context. Remember, Peter stops eating with them, and Paul takes him to task. Remember, he says, look, you can't do this. He says, why are you refusing to have fellowship with these Gentiles just because these people have come from Jerusalem and now they're looking over your shoulder, right? And remember, he really criticizes Peter about this, right? And then there's ultimately the Acts 15 council where James and Peter and John interrogate Paul and Barnabas to find out what they're actually teaching, and they come to an agreement over what it is for the Gentiles to be part of this congregation, this synagogue congregation that they have. And there's all those kinds of issues going on. So the ultimate result of all that is Peter, James, John, Paul, Timothy, all of them are practicing a Jewish way of life. And the documents of the New Testament clearly show that. They practice a Jewish way of life. And by the time you get to the last document in the New Testament, the Jewish way of life, now we're in AD 100. John is writing his Revelation, right, the last book. There's no indication that anything has changed over those 100 years. Gentiles are still coming into that way of life. In fact, there's plenty of historical documents other than the New Testament that show that that's the case. But it takes this war, this Bar Kokhba revolt, to start pushing the two groups apart. And ultimately, over the next 150 or 200 years, they finally separate, and the Christian church goes in one direction and Judaism goes in the other direction.
Now, help me understand their views versus Christ versus Jesus, the Christians and Jews.
You mean contemporary or in the biblical text?
Both.
Well, contemporary, it's pretty obvious. I mean, Jews don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah.
But I'm saying what happened there versus the from your understanding of why here yes and why here no is what I'm trying to say.
Okay, so imagine that you're a member of one of the synagogue assemblies. You're like me. I'm Norwegian. I don't know what background you are, but you obviously we're not Jewish, right? But we believe that Jesus is the Messiah.
Okay.
So Paul's argument is, if you believe Jesus is the Messiah, that's good enough for you to be part of the assembly, right? You don't have to be circumcised. You don't have to go through baptism. You don't have to study Torah, because you've been called. God's called you in. So there should be no human impediments, obstacles to the calling that God has on your heart, right? And so Paul argues that if God calls you and you believe that Yeshua is the Messiah, Jesus is the Messiah, then you should be part of the assembly. After you become part of the assembly, now you start to practice the way that we live. But you don't have to do that in order to become part of the assembly, right? All you need is God's calling, and that's the remember the story of Cornelius. Right? Peter goes off to Cornelius' house, and he says when he comes to the house, hey, these guys are Gentiles. I'm not even supposed to go in there. And then God says, shut up, Peter, and watch what I'm doing. And they have the Holy Spirit fall on them, and they start speaking in tongues, and Peter realizes, my goodness, God has called these people. Who am I to say they shouldn't belong? Right? That's the whole idea. The whole vision on the roof with the sheet coming down and the food, the animals, has absolutely nothing to do with people. With animals or food, it has to do with people. That, God's saying, if I call these people clean, who are you to call them unclean? Right? Because if I call them as Gentiles, you have to open the door for them. Okay, so let's suppose that happens. And you and I go to the assembly in the first century, right? What are we going to find there? We're going to find Orthodox Jews. We're going to find Orthodox Jews who believe that Yeshua is the Messiah. We're going to find Gentiles who are proselytes to Orthodox Judaism, and we're going to be there, Gentiles who are not proselytes, but we believe that Yeshua is the Messiah. All four groups in the same assembly, right? And we're all praying together, we're all having fellowship together, we're all eating meals together, we're all going to the temple together, we're all offering sacrifices together, no problem. Because nobody's going to say you don't belong here, because we're all part of the same way of living, right? Now, over the next 100 years, factions within that community start to develop their own ways of thinking. And ultimately, the Gentile intelligentsia, guys like Tertullian and Origen and Peter the Venerable and the guys who are the early church fathers, they start moving in a different direction. And they start changing the way that they act so that it's no longer acceptable to the Jews that they've been in fellowship with for 50 years, but now they're moving away. They're creating a new way of living, right? And the Jews are saying, wait a minute, if you're not following Moses, then how can you still be part of our group? This is how we live. We live according to the revelation to Moses. And you used to live like that, but now you're doing these things. So that helps to separate the two, right? But there are groups, and there's a long history about this, there are groups who maintain that same way of life until the 5th century. And ultimately the Christian church outlaws them, excommunicates them, and sometimes kills them.
Wow.
In order to maintain its own version of this stuff, right? So the history is pretty dismal. The history is about power, and
Right.
Once the church gets Rome behind it, then it can go execute people who disagree. But before, you were all in the same assembly and you disagreed on some things, and it was okay because you still could drink your wine and have your bread, and it was fine.
This man is
Right.
at least consistent with this power thing.
Yeah, I mean, the development of this whole story is really about power. It's about what happened when the Christian church, under Constantine, got the backing of the empire, so that now it could enforce what its doctrines were. You see, before it didn't have the ability to enforce those. Before, we would just disagree. But now I've got the empire behind me.
Right.
And if you disagree with me, I can have you killed. Makes a big difference.
Let's see, how can I ask this question? I'm trying to ask it in a way that it would make sense. What is probably, see if I can word this right. When you're in a room with all these different personalities,
Yeah.
when it comes to Jews and Christians,
Mhm.
and you're talking about the history and how this was developed and how that was developed, can you give me a story of something that happened where you, not looking for anything good or bad, but just the different people in the room and how they
Sure.
may respond to the different
Sure.
philosophies?
Yeah, for the last 8 or 9 years, I've been taking people to Israel on study tours. We don't do the sightseeing tours. We actually go there to learn and to study. And I always go with a really great friend of mine, an Orthodox Jewish rabbi, who actually believes that Jesus is the Messiah. Right? Okay, and we go.
I mean, is that a rare thing?
Yeah, it's pretty rare.
Right.
Yeah, but he's a wonderful man, and I mean we get along great.
Okay.
And we go to visit people who are Orthodox rabbis who don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah.
Okay.
And we sit down with them and discuss and talk. And like the last time I was in Jerusalem, we go to see my dear friend Moshe Kempinski, who's an Orthodox rabbi, right? And he doesn't believe Jesus is the Messiah. And we sit in his shop, and he teaches us. This whole group of people, 20 or so people that I've taken to Israel, and almost all of them come out of Christian backgrounds, right? And we sit and listen to this rabbi. And he is fantastic. His grip on Scripture is amazing. His devotion to God is absolutely clear. And he's willing to talk to us about these differences, right? So we can ask any question, and he will dialogue. And people walk away from those kinds of experiences saying, my goodness, I wish I had more of people like this around me, because now I can start to bridge these gaps, right?
But now, tell me what happens, or how do you, from a philosophy, spiritual way, deals with the doctrines when you have them side by side, or when it comes to doctrines?
Yeah. See, the problem is, as soon as we start digging in on doctrine, we don't have anything to talk about. That's the problem. Because the doctrines are really the things that divide us. What doesn't divide us is your friendship and mine, your spirit and mine, our willingness to listen to what God says, we're the same on that. Moshe Kempinski is this Orthodox Jewish guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't believe Jesus is the Messiah, and he and I have exactly the same desire to serve God, the same intensity about understanding what's happening, the same love for what God has done, right?
Mm-hmm.
The same transformation of our lives as a result of God's action. So we have lots in common. Mm-hmm. The only thing that separates us is these crazy doctrines. Mm-hmm. And the doctrines were developed out of this history of people separating instead of people coming together, right?
Okay.
So I'm looking at that and saying to Moshe, I've had lots of conversations with him. I would say, I know that the Christian doctrine is like this, and I know that yours is like this, but let's just set that aside and talk about the things that, how does God work in your life? Mm-hmm. And we have lots to talk about then, because there's nothing in competition now, right?
Well, we're not. I don't mean it as a competition, though.
Yes.
But I'm just trying to, and I'm talking about just trying to understand it.
Yes.
Trying to understand, sure. And it's not in a competition, but we're all in search of truth.
Sure, and I know that Moshe is really intent on understanding what the Scripture says, mm-hmm. and so am I. Right. So I can learn from him, and he can learn from me. And even if we have differences of opinion, it doesn't ever send us away from each other. He and I might disagree, and we will say to each other, wow, that's really interesting. Let's keep talking. Right? Instead of, oh, you don't agree with me? I can't talk with you anymore.
Generally, when you do have that spirit, it's not about the bank,
Sure.
So,
but the history of Judaism and Christianity is a history of doctrinal debate, mm-hmm. doctrinal antagonism. Mm-hmm. It's not about what happens at the personal level, mm-hmm. right? Personally, I find Orthodox rabbis wonderful people, mm-hmm. who are just as intent on serving God as I am. But so I don't let the doctrine get in the way of the relationship. And when you think about it, what is God really interested in? Isn't he interested in the relationships?
Right.
Isn't that the most important thing? When I look through the Bible, I don't find, when I page through the Bible, I don't find systematic theology. Mm-hmm. You know what I find? I find stories about people.
Right.
And about relationships. And about the ones that work and the ones that don't work. And I find that all the way through the Bible, I see God working with people and trying to develop relationships. I don't turn to the Bible and find a chapter that says the attributes of God, the doctrine of the church, the idea of, all the stuff that you find in the systematic theology text, I don't find in the Bible. What I find in the Bible is stories about people and the way that God interacts with them. Mm-hmm. And if I just stood my ground on, you have a story, I have a story, let's talk about what God's doing in our lives, we'd probably have a lot less arguments, wouldn't we?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And we'd probably have a lot fewer than 52,000 different denominations.
Yeah, which is that. I find that interesting as well. That's why.
Right.
Yeah, and this. Yeah.
See, I think one of the most important things that you learn from the text of the New Testament, from the Pauline letters, is how important it is to have differing opinions. The Greek word there is haresis. We translate it as heretic, but what it really means is one of a differing opinion, right? Now, if you and I agree on everything, then there's no reason for us to talk.
Right.
Because I'm just talking to myself.
Right.
Right?
Right.
It's really important that you and I don't agree on everything so that we both have something to learn.
Right.
So the most important person in your congregation is a heretic. Mm-hmm. Right? Not the person who agrees with you, but the one who disagrees.
Right.
Unfortunately, in most churches, the person who disagrees is the one who's sent away. Mm. Whereas that's the person that we ought to open our arms to and say, oh my goodness, please stay, because I have so much to learn from you. Right? If we did that, it would change everything, wouldn't it? It would change the way that we fellowship, the kinds of people that we bring in, our invitation to the community, because we would say, I'm open, come and talk. Mm. Yeah.
Now, you also did a session over at Westbrook, and I'm going to see if I can recall it where you, if you can remember. This was when I was really watching the men in the room, because some of the men in the room at Westbrook, they have money.
Okay.
And the session was about, let's see if I can, it was about not necessarily having the money, but God wants, and I think what you was trying to touch on was that the money will place you in a place to rely less on God, to think less of Him
Sure.
in your life, in your decisions, and how you go about your life. Am I phrasing that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's very biblical.
Right, right. So,
I mean, look, think. All you have to do is think about Solomon,
okay,
right? I mean, here's a man who has everything, and it absolutely is a disaster. You know, at the end of his life, he's as far from God as you could imagine. Just everything, but he's got power, money, wealth, fame. He's got everything he wants, except his relationship with God deteriorates the entire time. And I think that's why Jesus warns us about how difficult it is for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And because what he says is this: if you're blessed with power and fame and wealth, you don't need to rely on God in order to take care of yourself. Right? Now, there's a sense in which Proverbs says how important it is to have enough so that you won't steal. Remember that verse? He says you got to have enough so that you won't steal, but not so much that you ignore God. Right?
Right.
So there's this sort of in-between ground where you can take care of yourself, where you have enough to take care of yourself so that you're not in the position of being so poor that you want to steal from somebody in order to survive. But you also have to watch out for the fact that if you have more than you need, it tends to allow you to think, I don't need anybody else. I don't need to rely on God.
no, you kind of went into it in a depth way where you really kind of got into it, and I was listening, and I don't know if you remember what you were teaching that day, and what you were saying, but there's I don't know if we can really understand, because when you were talking about yesterday, today, and tomorrow, we always like to think for tomorrow in
Sure.
years, and so we want to set ourselves because we always think it's going to run out.
Sure. Remember, I mean, there's that great retirement planning advertisement that says,
Right.
will you live longer than your money, or
Right.
will your money run out before you die? You know, that
Right.
kind of stuff. Right?
But and I think what I'm trying to ask is the philosophy within ourselves is our lack of faith that God would take care of us.
I think that's part of it. I
Right.
think the other part is that we have the idea of blessing upside down. In other words,
Okay, yeah.
I mean, think about this. If you're a good father, you make sure that your children don't bear a burden too heavy for them. That's what you would do as a father, right? You know how much they can take. Like, you know, you have a small son, right? And you want him to grow, but you don't want him to be crushed.
Right.
So you as a father will make sure that the burdens that fall on him are not too heavy for his age, so that he can successfully manage those and take on a little more responsibility, right? Okay, so let's think about God as Father then.
All right.
Doesn't God know each one of us? He knows our limits.
Right.
He knows how much we can handle. Remember that verse that says God will never tempt you in such a way that you can't handle it. He's always there to make sure, right?
Right.
So he's a good father, all right? So now think about that in terms of blessing.
Right.
The people who we consider most blessed, the ones who have prosperity and, you know, big bank accounts and successful businesses, those are precisely the people that God knows he cannot ask too much of them, because they would be crushed under the burden of carrying his brokenheartedness about the world. So he pads their lives so that it's easier for them. The ones who that we look at and think, oh my goodness, what happened to them? They're suffering. They've had all kinds of disaster in their lives. There's calamity. Those are the people who are closer to God's heart. Because I can tell you that God weeps over this world. He doesn't come into this world celebrating and thinking that it's wonderful and blessed. He cries because of what's happening in the world. his heart is broken over what's happening in this creation. So if we're going to be like God, we should be like Jesus and weep over Jerusalem, right? That's not that is real blessing, to feel God's heart. But like a good father, he will make sure that he doesn't put that burden on people who can't bear it. So the prophets bear that burden, and it crushes them. Most of us, God says, you know, Skip, I know you can't handle too much of that, so I'm going to make sure that I take care of you over here so that you don't have to feel all that pain. And we think that's a blessing. But in actual fact, what God's doing is keeping us from feeling all the things that he feels. If we really looked at blessings, we'd look at them upside down. The people who are most blessed are the ones who suffer the most on God's behalf. The people who are least blessed are the ones that we think are the most prosperous and the most benefited by God. Right?
Now, Skip, most people would never understand that what you just said.
Of course not, because we've had...
No, I got you.
Yeah.
Because our selfishness, our greed, all the things that we think that we should have, and of course,
Yeah.
In a way, God don't give it to us because we can't handle
Right.
and things that may happen.
But we also have a tradition in Christian theology called the prosperity gospel, right? Which preaches that because God loves you, he wants to give you everything. So you should be prosperous, right? We forget that in order to become like the Messiah, we have to share in the Messiah's burden as well. So we forget about all that, right? We want the good stuff. I mean, that's just human nature. We want a good life, right? I mean, it's not like we're greedy and sinful and, you know, it's just part of what it means to be human. But we forget that God's calling us to be like him. And, you know, when he sends the prophets, it's because he's weeping over what's happening in the world, and the prophets feel that. They feel his heart, and they come sorrowful, right?
What you tell us about your books? I'm switched it up because I got some more. We're gonna talk a little bit, but yeah. Tell us.
I mean, I've written 9 or 10 books now, but I brought a couple that I thought would be interesting that we can talk about.
Okay.
This is, so you see the cover of this book?
Yeah.
That's the Beatitudes in Hebrew.
Okay.
Right now, when you read the Beatitudes in Matthew, you're reading a Greek translation because the Gospel of Matthew is written in Greek, but it wasn't spoken in Greek because obviously Jesus wasn't speaking Greek to a Hebrew audience. He was speaking Hebrew, right? So this book, called The Lucky Life, is about what the Beatitudes mean if I understand them from a Hebraic perspective. If I understand them according to what the audience heard when he was speaking to them. And, you know, we have those 4 or 5 little verses and we think, oh, you know, they're just the Beatitudes. But you know, the word beatitude doesn't even show up in Scripture. Beatitude comes from the Latin translation beatudo, which means to bless, which is why every verse starts with blessed are. But in Greek, it doesn't start with blessed. That isn't even the word. The word in Greek is makarioi, and it means to be lucky.
Really?
So, yeah, to be lucky, right? So this book is about, wait a minute, let's go back and rethink this according to what happened with the original audience, right?
Okay.
Then I brought these because this is the book that I wrote about the Hebrew view of women, which is really, really different than what the Christian church has taught for centuries. It's in fact, the Hebrew idea of women is very empowering. They are the capstone of God's creation. The whole idea of the creation language for women is about royal language, about the enormous responsibility that they have, and about how important they are. And it has changed so many lives that we did an abridged version for teenagers. This basically was written for 7,000 teenage girls in El Salvador. It was originally done in Spanish because we were trying to show them that they can actually change their culture if they adopt a Hebraic view of the role of women, right? Because they live in a machismo culture, and it's, you know, filled with gangs and drugs and all this kind of stuff, and they don't want to live like that, but the whole culture is like that. So I said, okay, I'll go down there, and I've spoken to thousands of teenage girls down there, And we did this book to help them understand what the biblical model for women was, right? And then the last one I brought is the latest one I've done. It's called Crossing: The Struggle for Identity. And it's about the story of Jacob when he crosses the Jabbok.
Okay.
Except it's not about Jacob, because Jacob's story begins with Abraham. So it's about all the generational dysfunction stuff, all of the generational trauma that gets passed from father to son to grandson to great-grandson that's in the Bible. And this is a study of the Hebrew story to show you where all the little clues are, where God is working all the time among all this mess that these people create.
Right.
So it's all about, how do I find out who I am in spite of all of the emotional trauma that I've inherited from my past. Yeah, so.
Now, your website.
It's really easy. It's skipmoen.com. All of my books, all 9 of them, are available on the website.
Okay.
And the website also offers more than 6,000 word studies now of individual Hebrew and Greek words, verses from the Bible, where you can go and see what the original language was and what the words meant and how they were understood in the culture. And, you know, there's all this stuff about the history and what happened and all that. There's lots and lots of audio and video material on there as well. And if you decide to become a supporter of the website, there's a daily email that's called Today's Word, and every day I write something about a verse from Scripture and show you one of the words in the verse and how it works in its original language, and then what it means in translation. And usually we talk about how the translations don't capture the full meaning of the word, and so then we explore it a little bit.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's been going on a long time now.
How long you been doing this, Skip?
I actually started the stuff that's on the website. I started that about 13 years ago now. But that came after a long period of basically ignoring what God was wanting to do in my life.
We didn't get a chance to talk about this go round. We're going to talk about it next go round.
We will.
Yeah, because I wanted you to tell that story. I remember that story. I'm going to get to that in the next time. But I want to thank you so very much. We're going to wrap this up now, but I'm so excited that you came. I still have a million questions, and man, you're so worldly.
Well, there's a lot. I mean, one of the best parts about the website is that it has an open blog so that you can come and ask questions.
Okay.
And there are readers in 63 countries around the world, and we dialogue all the time about what we're learning. So it's a great place where you can feel safe to ask any question you want, and people will help, add to your investigation. It's a great place.
Well, I definitely want to thank you for coming on the show.
You're welcome.
And,
it's a pleasure.
We're going to have to invite you back. When you have time, because you have so much information, and it is people like you and so many others. I'm always fascinated. Like with my pastor and the people that's in my circle, especially this time now that. We need you.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that.
Seriously, this world needs you now more than ever.
Well, I'm just encourage people to go to the website. There's lots of material there, and the best part about it is you can connect, at least in the web space, with people from all over the world who are really trying to understand this stuff and really, really digging into it.
All right. Well, we're definitely going to invite you back.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. We want to thank Skip for coming on the show, and again, you can always go to his website. I'm also going to post when I post this on my website, you will have his website information, and we definitely want to invite him back, and we want to thank him for taking the time. We know he's a busy guy. I'm Charles Morris, and thank you for watching The Journey 2020. The Journey 2020.